to a sniper's perspective, where we're calling it as we see. Get ready for the ride, 'cause this is where you wanna be. We're down deep into the darkness, expose the lies they weave. Hold on tight, my friend, 'cause this is where we achieve.
All right. Good morning. It's an overcast Sunday morning here in the Houston area. I'm Chris Mark. I am your host of A Sniper's Perspective. Glad to have you here. Appreciate today. We've got, I think, what's interesting, certainly a timely podcast I'm going to do. I no doubt am going to have some hate mail come in for this one, and that's okay. So we're going to talk about Israel, the war going on over there, anti-Semitism, a little bit of history. I've got a background in political science. We're going to talk about some of the history and things like that. There have been a lot of protests and things in the United States. And quite frankly, some of it has been a bit frustrating to me. I've got a number of Jewish friends. I have sat for Seder, a Jewish Passover with my Jewish friends, spent many hours with them talking about their experiences with anti Semitism over the years. And I was always really shocked to hear their stories because I just assumed us living in the United States, it wasn't that prevalent. And I would hear these stories, and boy, it was shocking to me. So, with what's going on today, I've got some comments I want to make. Obviously, these are my own beliefs, my own feelings. I will say that again, I've got a background in political science, pretty well read in certain things, but this will be a little bit of a history lecture, a little bit of a political science lecture, and then, of course, some commentary. And I'm sure everybody's going to be okay with that. One of the first things I want to do is make a recommendation for anybody that maybe doesn't have a college degree in political science or history. One of the best volumes of books I can recommend was one of the ones that I used in college, Martin Gilbert, A History of the 20th Century. It's a 3-volume set. You can find it on Amazon. I think you can get them for about $80 now. I don't know if they're still being printed, but you can certainly still get them on Amazon, even used. They make them in for Kindle, but just fantastic books, very academic. Cannot recommend them highly enough. So again, A History of the 20th Century by Martin Gilbert. If you have watched the news, any news over the past few weeks since the October 7th attack and invasion of Israel and the subsequent rocket attack by Iran on Israel, you will see people protesting all over the place. And it has become, quite frankly, more than just frustrating. I think it's a little bit deplorable. You've got the USC canceling the pro Palestinian valedictorian speech. And then at the bottom there, obviously, you've got Columbia University, a bunch of privileged white kids wearing keffiyehs talking about and screaming, "We are Hamas," and screaming about Intifada and calling Jews pigs and things like that. I always find it really curious when you've got a bunch of privileged white kids that take the mantle of oppression and decide that it's their mantle to wear, all the while walking to their classes, passing by people in tents in the United States that are homeless and starving, but they're worried about something going on 9,000 miles away that I would argue they likely have little understanding of. Now, that being said, I do try to give a pass to college kids and younger people. I understand the idealism. When you're younger, there's an old expression, if you're young and not liberal, you have no heart. If you're older and not conservative, you have no mind. I think there's some truth to that. When we see college kids being very idealistic, they probably don't have a great grasp oftentimes of the underlying issues, and that's okay. What's more frustrating to me is when you have dolts. I think that's the best way I can use to explain it, like Susan Sarandon, who comes out and says Jews have to be afraid for themselves today in America. Now they have just a taste of what it's like to be Muslim in America today. That is one of the most ignorant statements I've heard in a long time. Statistically, Jews experience hate crimes 380% more often than Muslims do, 3.8 times more often than Muslims do in the United States. So here she is, Oscar winning actress, just coming out making blindly ignorant statements. So that's one of the things that kind of prompted me to do this podcast. So let's start with this. I'm going to give a little bit of a background because I'm going to bring up some topics later. And I think this will help people with some of the concepts. So nation states, one of the arguments you hear all the time from people is, well, the Palestinians have been in that area, what is now Israel, the Levant, all of that for thousands of years. It's a little bit disingenuous. That's not necessarily accurate. But let's talk about nation states and countries and what they are. The idea of countries and nation states as we know them today with discrete borders and laws and things like that really did not exist until about 1648 with the end of the 30 Years' War and the Treaty of Westphalia. And that's when we started seeing that. Before we had empires and we had kingdoms and stuff like that. So you would have nations of people that would live in areas, certainly. When we talk about the Palestinians living in what is now Israel thousands of years ago, the Palestinians from Jesus's time were distinctly different than the Palestinians today, but that's okay. We'll talk about that a little bit more. My next statement, again, this is my opinion. If you don't like it, that's fine. That's why you're listening to my podcast. You don't have to like it. You can always dislike a comment I make. Anti-Semitism is a form of racism. Okay. Being Jewish is not a race, it is an ethnicity. It's also a religion. Discrimination based upon ethnicity is racism. It involves prejudice, hatred, or discrimination against Jews on the basis of their religious beliefs and ethnic background. So, anti Semitism is racism. We talk a lot about racism in our country: black on white racism, white on black racism, white on Asian racism, Hispanic racism. We talk about racism a lot here. And for some strange reason, anti Semitism tends to fall by the wayside. It is not simply discrimination based on religious beliefs, it is also a form of racism. This next statement, I'll say it loud, I'll say it proud. If you support Hamas, Intifada, and or anti-Zionism, you are calling for the destruction of Israel. If you call for the destruction of Israel, Israel being a nation state, which means not only is it a country, but it also has very close cultural implications, religious implications with its population. 75% of the population is Jewish. If you're calling for the destruction of Israel, you are in fact anti Semitic. That is my opinion. If you don't like it, I get it, but I will stand by that statement every day of the week. And I say it loud, I say it proud. If you support Hamas, you're anti Semitic. I'm going to define this term. Actually, I didn't define it. It got defined in 1944, but boy, I'm hearing this thrown about a lot lately. Genocide. We've got to stop the Jews' genocide of the Palestinians. So, what is genocide? Genocide was coined by a Polish lawyer, Raphael Lemke, in 1944. It's defined as the deliberate and systematic extermination of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group in whole or in part. That term is thrown around pretty quickly, pretty loosely. Is what's going on in the West Bank. Is that genocide? I would say absolutely does not fit the definition there. I would say conversely, if you look at the persecution that Jews have suffered over the last 2,000 years, I would say absolutely they have faced genocide time and again. Here are a few more points to consider as we go through this. Again, this is just a little bit of backstory so that we can, or rather, I can lecture, and I always welcome comments on here. There are roughly 20 million Jews in the world in 2024. Of those, about 7.5 million live in Israel, and roughly 7.5 million or 7 million live in the United States. The rest are spread primarily over Europe, but there are about 20 million Jews in the or in the world today. Compare that to the fact there are 2 billion Muslims in the world in 2024. There are 1.2 billion Catholics, 1.1 billion Hindus, and 500 million Buddhists in the world in 2024. So the Jewish population in the world is exceedingly small, very small population. But boy, they take the lion's share of insults and harassment and persecution. So in the United States, we're a country of roughly 360 million people. Jews account for roughly 2% of our population, but they are victims of 55% of hate crimes as of 2022. 55% of the hate crimes in the United States are perpetrated against 2% of our population. 2%. Now, this is instructive. I'm going to make some comparisons as I go through this, and I don't want anybody to think I'm anti-Islamic, anti-Muslim. I've got a lot of Muslim friends. I love it. I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, spent a lot of time in Africa, but it's instructive to make some comparisons. So Muslims account for about 1.1% of the population in the United States. We talk about Islamophobia. And again, Susan Sarandon, that dolt, made a pretty bold statement that was factually incorrect, but it gets people inflamed. So 1.1% of our population is victimized 8% of the time in hate crimes. So compare that to the Jewish population. 2% of the population victimized 55% of the time. 1.1% of the population, the Muslims, victimized 8% of the time. If you were to normalize that in statistics, That means for each 1% of the population, the Jews are targeted 27.5% of the time. They are victimized 25.5% of the time. Muslims are targeted 7.2% of the time, which means Jews are targeted 3.8 times as frequently as Muslims in the US. So it just goes to show statistically how pervasive anti Semitism is in the United States, how pervasive it is. And the questions are complex as to why it's pervasive, but it is pervasive. So, what is a Jew? It seems like a pretty simple question. I did some research on this because, quite frankly, I thought I understood what a Jew was. Using the term Jew, it's contextual. So, saying what is a Jew is not pejorative. If I were to use it in a different context, the word Jew could be pejorative. But what is a Jew? Is it somebody? Is it a religion? Is it a nationality? What is it? It's all of those. But I was researching this podcast probably 20 people that I know, and I asked them, I said, "Hey, what is a Jew? Explain to me, what is a Jew? What is a Jewish person?" And I would hear people say, "A Jew is somebody that follows the Jewish faith." Okay. I would hear people say, "Somebody that lives in Israel." Okay. "Somebody whose mother was Jewish." Okay. Which one of those is correct? Technically, they're all correct. And so there are basically four different definitions that I could find. And hey, I'm not a Jewish scholar. So if you're a Jewish scholar, please give my naivety here a bit of a break. Did my best to do some research, but there are basically four kind of common definitions. You have the religious definition. Certainly, a Jew is someone who is born to a Jewish mother or who has converted to Judaism through an accepted process according to Jewish law. You're a Jew. There are ethnic and cultural definitions. A Jew is an individual who identifies as part of the Jewish people, an ethno religious group that shares common ancestors from the ancient tribes of Israel and Judah. Okay. So we understand that's where the ethnic part comes in. So Israel has a legal definition. In the context of Israeli law, particularly the law of return, a Jew is defined as someone born to a Jewish mother or who has converted to Judaism and who is not a member of another religion. This legal definition is designed to determine eligibility for immigration and citizenship rights in Israel. So there is the legal definition. Then, of course, there's self identification and community acceptance. Beyond formal definitions, being a Jew can also relate to personal identity and community acceptance. So there are four different definitions. So it's not as cut and dried as saying this person is or is not Jewish. What I find, I hate to use the word fascinating, but what I do find a bit curious, and I used to spend many hours talking to a good friend of mine. I'm not going to use any names in here because, again, the prevalence of anti Semitism is pretty high, and I don't want anybody trying to track down my friends. But I had a very good Jewish friend, and I would sit there and talk to him for hours about his experiences with anti Semitism. And here's a man that looks just like me. He looks exactly like me. And by the way, I'm not Jewish. Like I said before, I have no dog in this fight other than an interest because I do support Israel. I do support my Jewish friends, but I am not Jewish. But my Jewish friend would tell me he would go to his locker in high school and people would have put swastikas on it. And I thought, wow, why? And here's somebody that looks exactly like me. His family name was changed when they came over through Ellis Island. So his family name did not sound like it was Jewish from Europe or from the Middle East or anything else. He just looked like a regular old white dude like me, yet somehow the people in his school knew he was Jewish. And simply being Jewish was enough for him to be victimized with anti Semitic attack. And I was really surprised by that and a little bit horrified. And it's a little bit difficult to believe. But after October 7th, and you start seeing the increase of anti Semitism, and certainly even after Iran attacked Israel, you start seeing the increase. It really comes full force, and you see it right there in the news every single day. Politicians talking about it, college students protesting about it, people talking about it all over the place. It really has come full force. So we're going to talk about it today. So let's talk about persecution of Jews. Boy, this is a very short list. I'm not going to cover probably all of them. The persecution of Jews goes back to at least 3000 BC. But even in 1240, there was something called the 1240 AD, the disputations of the Talmud and the Paris trials. And what that basically said was the Talmud, the Jewish religious book, was now considered to be sacrilege to what is now the Catholic Church. It used to just be called the Church. And that meant that if you were Jewish, you could be charged with being sacrilegious and you could actually be burned at the stake. 1251, you had the Shepherd's Crusade. In 1290, King Edward expelled all Jews from England, just said, hey, we don't want Jews in England, get out of here. 1306, King Philip VI expelled all Jews from French territories. Now, he did that primarily for financial reasons, but in 1315, he allowed them to come back. 1322, Charles IV banned Jews again. In 1394, they were permanently expelled from France. 1349, you had the Strasbourg execution. 900 Jews were killed after being blamed for the Black Death. They rounded up a bunch of Jews and they burned them at the stake. Another 6,000 were killed in mines in Cologne. 1492, the Alhambra decree ordered the expulsion of Jews from Spain unless they convert to Christianity. They were called conversos. So if you converted to Christianity, you were called a converso. Now, here's where it got tricky. We had something called the Spanish Inquisition. A lot of these Jews would, of course, quote, convert so that they wouldn't be burned at the stake. They were called conversos, but of course, they were always on the lookout for these Jews that had converted, yet were practicing Jews in secrecy. And a lot of these Jewish people did practice their faith in secrecy. They were still devout Jews, but they had to pretend like they were Christians. But if they were caught, they were burned at the stake. 1497, they were expelled from Portugal and forced to convert or leave. There is a fantastic book called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. And if you get a chance to read it, fantastic book. And it talks about the expulsion of Jews from Europe and how a lot of them went on to be pirates, privateers, and pirates down in the Caribbean. There is a belief that Christopher Columbus may have actually been Jewish. He was a converso. He was very close with Queen Isabella. And she told him and said, hey, you need to get the heck out of here or bad things may happen. It was during the time of the Inquisition. There's a belief that he may have actually been Jewish. So again, if you're looking for a good book on this topic, it's called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. 1648, 1657, the Khmelnytskyi uprising in Poland and Ukraine, 100,000 Jews are killed. And of course, 1941, 1945, we've got the Holocaust, which people today still deny. It defies logic. It blows my mind that even today people try to deny that happened. 6 million Jews were killed. To put that in perspective, that's when the population of Jews in the world was only about, I think, about 15 million. They killed 6 million Jews, almost wiped out all the Jewish population in Europe. But you want to talk about persecution. They've had persecution. So it is, again, a bit frustrating when we hear about what's going on over there and Israel is being blamed for all of this. Now, let me make a statement here quickly. I made a statement earlier that said, if you are calling for the destruction of Israel, you're anti-Semitic. I agree with that. I'm American. I'm a veteran. I'm a combat veteran. I serve my country. Does that mean I agree with everything the United States does in foreign policy? Absolutely not. I'm pretty vocal about my opposition. First of all, I don't think we should have been in the first Gulf War. Certainly don't think we should have been in the second Gulf War or should have gone to Iraq the second time. I think both of those were probably illegal wars. We went over there. Don't have to agree with a country's foreign policies or even a country's domestic policies. It does not mean that I dislike the residents of that country or the citizens of that country or the people that make up that country. And that's the difference. I can look at Israel and say, I don't agree with your foreign policy. I don't agree with the way you comport yourself during this armed conflict. I don't agree with that. But to simply say Israel doesn't have the right to exist because of their response to being invaded, that to me is certainly an overreach. So, what is the history of Israel? Once again, I brought up a few minutes ago and said, you hear people make these arguments. Oh, the Palestinians were there for thousands of years and the Jews just came in the 1940s and gosh, gee, that's not true. So we're going to talk briefly about the history of it. We're not going to go way back because this would cover pages and I could do multiple podcasts just on the history of the people in that whole area. But it's important to remember. So, well, you did have Palestinians and you had Jews living in that area for, a couple of thousands of years. Remember, so back, Islam really was founded in the 7th century. The date really is about 622, common era where it was founded. The Ottoman Empire comes about. So the Ottoman Empire actually controlled what was considered Palestine from the 1500s to 1922. Okay, the Ottoman Empire, which was primarily Muslim. Now, they did allow Jews to live there and they treated them okay. Now, I say okay because one, they were considered, and I hope I'm pronouncing this word correctly, Dhimas, they were considered second-class citizens, which means they didn't have the same legal rights as Muslims had. So you're considered a second-class citizen, which disadvantaged you already in certain areas. You also had to pay something called a jizya, which is a tax that other Muslims didn't have to pay. Only Jews had to pay that. It was a separate tax. So they were second class citizens that were taxed separately. So, well, they were allowed to live in that area. Of course, that area was run by the Ottoman Empire. Now, why did the Ottoman Empire get out of there around that time? If you recall, in 1914, there was something happened. It was called World War One. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the German Empire, and the Ottoman Empire got into a war with the rest of the world. They lost that war, and in response, the empires were all broken up. And in response to that, the Ottoman Empire was broken up, and what is now Palestine, the British United Kingdom was given control. The British Empire was given control over what's now called Palestine as a colonial power. Okay, so in 1900 and 1914, you had Aliyah, you had Jewish immigration started growing into that area, motivated by Zionist ideals. Zionism simply means it's a form of Jewish nationalism where people say, "Hey, we want to have our own homeland, our own state back." This is no different than Americans when they wanted to have their own homeland. No different than what you're seeing right now with the Intifada belief with the Palestinians. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British government, where they came out and formally endorsed Jews having their own state. So that was called the Balfour Declaration in 1917. In 1920, the League of Nations granted Britain the mandate over Palestine. This was at the end of World War One. So once again, immigration increased even more because now the Ottoman Empire was out of the equation. 1936, 1939, you had the Arab Revolt in Palestine, nationalist uprising against British colonial rule. 1939 to 1949 or 45, of course, you had the Holocaust. We talked about that. 6 million Jews are killed. In 1947, the Brits were unable to reconcile Jewish and Arab aspirations. So they went to the United Nations and said, "Hey, we got a problem here. We've got Jews, we've got Arabs. They can't seem to get along. We can't figure out how to fix it." Again, Britain was in charge of Palestine at the time as a colonial power. So in 1947, the UN adopted Resolution 181, recommending partitioning of Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. So you were going to have a Jewish state and an Arab state. It's important to remember here, this happened in 1947 before Israel was actually a state. The Arab leaders rejected that. They said, no, we want it all or we want nothing. So there was an option right there for a two-state solution, an Arab state and a Jewish state. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. So May 14th, 1948, state of Israel is declared by David Ben-Gurion in Tel Aviv. Right after that, you had the Arab-Israeli War of Independence. So you had Arab states invaded. Israel defended its position, defended itself successfully. It also expanded its boundaries to give itself more protection. Okay. And then you had, I'm sorry, didn't mean to get ahead. Sorry about that. And then in 1949, the UN formally recognized and accepted Israel into the United Nations. So that's the history of Israel. So they became a state, a nation state, and a country. And they've been there for a long time, but by 1949, they were actually a country. So now let's talk about wars, because there's a lot of noise being made about, again, Israel is beating up on the poor Palestinians over there for a very small country. So Israel is roughly the size of New Jersey, both in land. It's about 92% the size of New Jersey, so about 8% smaller in land size than New Jersey. And it has nearly the population of New Jersey. So it's about 8.9 million to New Jersey's, I think, or yeah, it's about 8.9 million to New Jersey's about 9.3 million or something like that. So they're roughly the same size. So imagine New Jersey being in the Middle East. So 1948, you had the Arab-Israeli War. You had Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and everybody else invaded Israel. Israel won that. In 1956, you had Egypt shut down the Suez Canal and say no Israeli ships are allowed through here. So Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula in a joint operation with France and Britain so that they could open up the Suez Canal. The result of that was Egypt nationalizing the Suez Canal. In 1967, you had the Six-Day War. It was a preemptive strike against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. 1973, you had the Yom Kippur War. Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. 1982, you had the first Lebanon War, initiated by Israel to combat the PLO. 2006, you had the second Lebanon War, which was again initiated by Israel to combat Hezbollah. Now, if you look at the colors up here in blue, these were wars that were initiated by Israel's neighbors against them. In the black were wars that were initiated by Israel preemptively. And in the red were the wars that were initiated in response to terrorist activity, the PLO and Hezbollah. And the reason I'm bringing this up is Israel has been attacked since they have become a country over and over. And we just saw yet again, Iran has been threatening them for decades and finally launched a surprise attack with 350 drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles against Israel just a week and a half ago. So this has been going on. But that was not the first rocket attack. So these are some notable rocket and missile attacks against Israel just in the last 20 years. Now, there have been over 20,000 rockets and missiles fired into Israel in 20 years, 20,000. And these are most often unguided rockets that land or are intended to land in urban areas and kill civilians. These are not fired against military targets. These are just rockets that are fired from the West Bank and places like that into Israel, hoping to hit urban areas and kill civilians. You had the second intifada, you had 500 rockets. You had the Hezbollah rocket fired in 2006, Lebanon war, 4,000 rockets. The list goes on and on. And here we are with the Iranian attack in April 2024, where 350 ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and drones were shot into that. So I go back again to the question of who is really trying to displace or kill whom. And it's very difficult when we see this to say that it's Israel really starting all of these fights and all of these wars. When you see 20,000 rockets and missiles being fired into a country the size of New Jersey, I think the question of genocide does come up. Okay. This is more than just kind of nationalist aspirations. This is trying to destroy a country. And if you look at a lot of these Muslim states or states that have primarily Muslim populations, almost universally, they call for the destruction of Israel and even dispute the right that they have to exist there. So, again, when we talk about genocide, where is it really coming from? Now, one of the more interesting aspects that I would say when we start talking about this is I question people 9,000 miles away or so, or however far we are from Israel. I think it's about 9,000 miles where I live, sitting over here decrying Israel's right to self defense after they have been attacked not once, but twice. They had Hamas led terrorists come into their country, brutally kill 1,200 civilians, then absolutely brutalize and rape numerous people. And it was really disturbing to me how many people disputed the fact that the rapes had happened. There was video evidence. You had doctors saying this. It was as just disturbing as people saying the Holocaust never existed. And now you have people saying that Israel doesn't have the right to defend herself against that. You have Iran that came in and attacked Israel. Now people are crying even louder, saying that Israel does not have the right to defend herself against 350 rocket and missile attack. Our own feckless President Biden is trying to keep Israel from defending herself. In fact, he came out yesterday or the day before and said that he was considering filing sanctions on Israel for human rights violations for military operations that predated the October 7th situation, that predated that. So how convenient is that now that here we are in, April, that he's thinking about filing sanctions on Israel for human rights violations that predated April? You want to talk about a feckless president that does not support our biggest ally in the Middle East? That would be Joe Biden. But what I have to ask is all these people, whether it be Susan Sarandon or these college kids or anybody that's over there saying, I am Hamas or Israel doesn't have a right to defend herself or calling for the destruction of Israel, are they really mad at Israel or are they mad at that Jewish person that lives next door to them? Are they mad at that Jewish lawyer that helped their, ex-spouse in their divorce? Are they mad at that Jewish kid that goes to school with their child and is getting better grades? Where is this hatred really coming from and where is it really directed? In my mind, in my opinion, I think it's a bit of projecting when they say, hey, I disagree with Jewish people and I disagree with Israel on this. Meanwhile, I'm walking by hundreds of people that are homeless and starving on my own streets. But hey, Israel's committing genocide. Who are they really pointing the finger at? Is it really Israel as a country or is that Jew next door? Again, look at the statistics. 2% of our population is victimized by 55% of the hate crimes, 55% of the hate crimes. And again, I'm not trying to pick on Muslims, not trying to pick on Islam or anything else, but it is instructive to make a comparison. Instructive to make a comparison. On 9/11, 2001, I watched in real time as the Twin Towers were attacked and 3,000 of my fellow Americans were killed, not by Jewish terrorists, by Muslim terrorists from Saudi Arabia. 19 Muslim terrorists from Saudi Arabia killed over 3,000 of my countrymen and women as I watched in real time. In spite of that, Islamophobia in the United States still has not achieved the level of anti-Semitism in the United States. That to me defies logic. So again, if you're sitting there calling for the destruction of Israel, saying they don't have a right to self-defense, saying they don't have a right to exist, you need to ask yourself, are you really pointing the finger at Israel or are you pointing the finger at your Jewish neighbor and that Jewish person that you know? And that's my belief. And I'm sure that's going to offend some people, but I think we need to have these discussions because it really is, in my opinion, right now, growing out of control with the anti Semitism. Just if you guys want to know, again, I do statistics for a living. If you look at the wealthiest demographics in the United States, the most educated, the wealthiest, white people, obviously, Caucasians make up the biggest part of the population in the United States. But the wealth, they say the wealthiest 61% are Caucasians. The wealthiest 21% are Jewish. Now, this is 2% of our population that control 21% of the wealth in the United States, according to a stat I read yesterday. When you look at some of the reasons I think that we see persecution of the Jews, they tend to be I'm not trying to stereotype because stereotyping on either side is not good. But if you look statistically, Jewish people tend to be, as a group, much like Asian people, very industrious, focused on education, focused on things like that. You see a lot of doctors, lawyers, bankers, folks like that. They're very focused on education, being very industrious, being very successful. Do I think that that may breed some contempt? Probably. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but I think it does. But again, it shocks me that we see people like Susan Sarandon walking around making these statements. And I just felt like it was something we needed to talk about today. So I'm sure I'm going to get some hate mail on this. Anytime I talk about something controversial, the hate mail seems to fly pretty quickly. And that's okay. That's okay. I appreciate everybody listening to me today. My personal belief is yes, I do support Israel. I support her right to self defense. Does that mean that I agree with all the things that Israel does from a foreign policy perspective? Absolutely not. I don't agree with my own country, especially these days, probably half the time. But that doesn't mean that I dislike being an American or I dislike Americans any more than my disagreeing with Israel from a foreign policy perspective means that I dislike her residents, 75% of which are Jewish. It doesn't mean that I dislike Israel and their people. I've spent time in Israel. I love Israel. It's a beautiful country. Certainly the history is great. And so, yeah, I really appreciate everybody listening. This has been a fun 35 minutes, and hopefully you learned a little bit. And we will catch you on the flip side on a sniper's perspective. And so, thank you very much. And with that being said, have a great afternoon. Thank you.